Live-in aide or roommate. This is a presentation by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, Office of Community Housing. Sometimes when somebody decides they want to live independently, they decide that they would want somebody to live with them. Maybe have a live-in aide or maybe a roommate. Maybe they need a little help or maybe they just need some companionship. This is a way to kind of discern what's appropriate, what can be gotten, what can't be gotten, and what's the best way to go about getting it. What is a live-in aide? A live-in aide is somebody that can be gotten through a reasonable accommodation, which is an exception to the rules for a housing choice voucher or state rental assistance program. This would make a person be able to get, say, a 2-bedroom apartment when all they really need is a 1-bedroom apartment. A live-in aide is also a person who is essentially there to care for the well-being of a person with a disability, is not obligated for the support of the person with a disability insofar as financial support, would not live in the unit except to provide necessary supportive services, and is not a parent, grandparent, guardian, or spouse. The benefits are that it can enhance the consumer-directed personal assistance supports provided through waiver or private pay. The attendant gets paid by waiver and gets free rent. The individual gets overnight presence in addition to an authorized waiver hours. The individual family can choose someone they trust. In the state rental assistance system, this can be a sibling, cousin, aunt, uncle, or friend. This is not the case with some housing choice vouchers, however. In that case, they don't allow any family member that was currently living with an individual to move into an apartment with an individual and call themselves a live-in aide. This more or less kind of provides that they're not doing a 2-for-1 kind of deal. We want to make sure that there is a helper situation, not a family member benefiting from a voucher that another individual can get. The live-in aide gets his or her own bedroom at no extra cost. The disadvantages are that it's sometimes hard to find new live-in aides when there is turnover, and the individual or family may become the employer subject to labor and fair tax laws. How does it work? So the first thing you need to do is identify someone who agrees to be the live-in aide. We ask that this be put on the referral prior to submitting a referral for a subsidy. The reason being is that we'd like to know the relationship of the individual moving in. And in addition to that, the landlord is going to want to do some type of background check on the live-in aide and ensure that this person is able to be an authorized occupant in the unit. We also need the case manager to request a reasonable accommodation from state rental assistance and explain the disability-related need for a live-in aide and get third-party verification. Doctor's notes are also helpful for this purpose. Be prepared to be an employer. Live-in aides are considered live-in home care workers, not unlike a maid or a housekeeper or a gardener that may live in a person's home. Live-in aides also are under the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act and are covered under live-in home care workers. The employer is typically the individual or his or her family, or the individual or family and an agency. It's important to kind of discern what works better for your situation. And the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act also has a special minimum wage and overtime wage rule for live-in home care workers. How does it work continued? Individuals or families who employ live-in aides can count the lesser of the following towards the live-in aide's wages. Actual cost for a live-in caregiver's housing. Fair market rent value of a live-in caregiver's housing. Rent subsidy is not a substitute for wages owed to a live-in aide. If the live-in aide is paid cash wages, the employer may have to withhold Social Security and Medicare taxes from the paycheck, report wages and federal file tax returns, and pay federal and state unemployment taxes. The Department of Labor Home Care Guide is at this link. Please feel free to take a photo or a screenshot of this particular slide so that you have this information at the ready. The ARC of Northern Virginia also has a really helpful live-in care attendant guide. So here's an example of a situation that is currently in the Arlington area. This is Pete. He's on the DD waiver wait list and got a one-time special admissions preference voucher from Arlington County. He requested a reasonable accommodation for a live-in aide, moved into a tax credit property, and he has a live-in aide named Chris. Chris helps keep Pete on schedule to go to work, prompts him to clean the apartment and do his laundry and takes him shopping. They make meals together and socialize. Pete's family pays Chris a small stipend to cover weekly hours worked. Notice that Pete goes to work. So while Pete's at work, he might not need the assistance of Chris. So Chris at that moment is free to pursue his interests or his desires. He may be a student, or maybe he has another job that he goes to. It's fair to note that the person who is a live-in aide has no income restrictions insofar as what they make, because their income is not being included or considered in this situation. So if they are independently wealthy or a full-time student, they are able to be a live-in aide and get that free apartment room in that apartment. Roommates. So roommates are a lot different. The definition of a roommate is when two or more people agree to live together in the same unit and split the cost of the apartment, utilities, and upkeep. Each individual on the lease, unless otherwise negotiated with the landlord, agrees to be fully responsible for the rent. This means if one of the roommates moves out, the others are still responsible for the entire amount. If not paid in full, each of the tenants can and will be held responsible and could face eviction. Each roommate has the right to enjoy their home and have guests and visitors and use the common areas as needed. Each roommate has the right to tenancy and can only be evicted by the landlord for breaking the landlord's rules. And each tenant can come and go as they please without having to answer to their roommate. So consider this. A roommate can have guests and visitors as they'd like, as long as it's within the parameters of the lease. If the lease allows three nights consecutively of an overnight guest, they can have an overnight guest for 3 days, even if it's somebody you don't like, even if it's somebody that you don't feel safe with. They can have that guest for 3 nights overnight. Maybe the lease says they can have them up to 14 days consecutively. That's something that the landlord is responsible for enforcing. So if the individual's roommate has somebody there for 14 days in a row and it's within the lease boundaries, the individual can't do anything about that if they don't like their roommate's choice of guests. The other thing is keeping up with rules. The person can come and go as they please. So say the roommate likes to stay out till 3 o'clock in the morning, come home, watch TV, turn on the microwave, slam the doors. Can't do anything about that. That's their prerogative to use their apartment as they like and come and go as they please. And also the idea that if one of the roommates decides to bail and just takes off and doesn't care about their credit rating, doesn't care about their responsibilities or anything, um, they're going to also affect the credit ratings and the other uh, the other expenses of the other people in the unit. If one person bails, the other person is responsible to pick up the slack insofar as rent and utilities are concerned. Um, some benefits, however, are companionship. Some of us don't like to come home to an empty house. It reduces the cost of living independently by sharing expenses. You learn to share responsibilities while gaining experience to possibly live alone in the future. Um, Cost of living expenses. It's important that we know the income of the individual that's also moving in as the roommate, that we also know how the utilities and the rent will be divided. Sometimes combining incomes, and on a lease, you're going to have to do that. If they're both on the lease, you're going to have to combine incomes for the subsidy. Um, it can affect the ability to get a subsidy. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. The disadvantages: if you don't end up liking your roommate or their habits, you're essentially stuck with them for the length of the lease. Leases typically last a year. It's really important to tease out all you can while planning and to make sure you have the ability to negotiate and compromise as needed. I have forms at the end of this presentation that have some roommate agreements, and it can help facilitate discussions prior to making those arrangements and making decisions. And if your roommate damages the unit, you'll both be held responsible for the damage. If your roommate sneaks a cat into their bedroom and the cat tears up that bedroom, you're also responsible for those damages. So it's important to make sure that you understand that. Disadvantages continue. If your roommate moves out of the unit, the remaining tenants may be responsible for the lease that states each tenant is jointly and severably liable. Tenants can have overnight guests or friends over that are unwelcome by other tenants. A landlord's not going to walk into an apartment and know whose bedroom is whose, which mess is whose, who did what damage to whose, the stove, who tore up the stove, or who broke the cabinet doors. Um, they're not there to play Judge Judy. They're there to make sure that they get the apartment ready for the next tenant. So whoever was on the lease is responsible for that apartment, period. Um, so how does one find a roommate? You can advertise for a roommate. You can use a roommate match service. You could get help with these tasks by a trusted family member or friend. Um, Sometimes people you don't know are better roommates than people you do know. Roommates cannot be parents, grandparents, or guardians. Roommates can be friends or other family members. And again, the decisions, you have to have meetings and preparation prior to apartment hunting so you know what you're looking for and what kind of apartments you want. You need to decide how much rent and utilities you can afford with combined income. I used to work with a gentleman who wanted to move in with another gentleman, and I was his case manager. And we went out apartment hunting, and the conversation came up about cable TV. And the individual I was working with said he wanted to get the full package, which would cost upwards of $300 a month. The person he was moving in with or planning on moving in with didn't want cable at all. He just wanted an antenna. So they were able to realize that they wouldn't make good roommates because they wouldn't be able to divide the cost of the cable. Had they wanted to live in separate, or if they wanted to have their own TVs in separate bedrooms, that's fine. And my client could have paid the entire $300 bill by himself. But since he couldn't afford that, and since the other person didn't want to split it with him, it it didn't work out. So they decided wisely not to become roommates together. If rental assistance is required, work with housing coordinator to learn that the combined income will not be too much for the rental assistance eligibility. If rental assistance is not required, make sure you and the potential roommate are upfront about financial barriers, criminal history, credit barriers, so that landlords don't end up making you realize something about your roommate that you didn't know prior to apartment hunting. Apply for rental assistance and prepare for the housing search. Prepare for the outlay of monies required for deposits and furnishings, and review and sign roommate agreements. So here are some lists of contracts and forms that we find helpful for individuals to um, meet about and utilize prior to moving in with each other. It can kind of really provoke some discussion that could be helpful. And here are some other additional links that could be helpful. This is a map of all the regions that we are divided up in and the contact information for each regional housing coordinator. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We're always available and really love to kind of get to know who's going to be sending in referrals so that we can start working with folks as early on as possible and help prepare them for a successful move.
Here's a closer look at the contact information for each regional housing coordinator so you can see it a little more clearly.
So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We appreciate your staying and learning about the difference between live-in aides and roommates. And again, reach out to your housing coordinator with any more personal or involved questions. Thank you.